I've had nights where I've just like consumed myself with a bunch of berries and milk and honey and maple syrup, and I'll still wake up the next morning and test my ketones, although I haven't done it in a while. But I'll still be in a ketogenic state, and my glucose won't be like super high either.
All right, so in case you haven't figured out, I'm here with Noah Syndergaard, who's, I mean, actually before we like dive into this, like, how did you come across me? Like, because that's,
I think I heard you on one of Ben Greenfield's podcast, and it was all like an episode about magnesium.
oh, cool.
Do you remember that one at all?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And which Mag SRT, is that the brand that you were affiliated with, or still? I don't know. But that was like many years ago. I still don't remember what it was, but I was just blown away, and I've been following you ever since.
Nice, man.
And today's video is sponsored by Thrive Market. So if you're looking for foods to kind of throw into your regime, you may want to check them out. So that link is down below in the description. They're an online membership-based grocery store. So whether you're muscle building, whether you are doing paleo or vegan or whatever, they have something for you all in one place. And then it gets delivered right to your doorstep. So I use it a lot of times to stock up my pantry. Like if I'm looking for specific like keto baked goods, or maybe looking for gluten-free kind of like baking stuff for my wife, any things like that. So that link is down below in the description, and it will save you 25% off your first order, plus get you a free gift since they are such an awesome sponsor on this channel. So check them out after this vid.
So what I want to dive into a little bit today is like, Noah follows a pretty interesting diet. I mean, you're not keto per se, but you're also not carnivore. You're kind of like this bridge of that, along with some hybrids. I mean, you're really the kind of diet that I aspire to have myself. You know, it really, like, you've done a really good job of crafting it, and I think, you know, in light of injuries and everything like that, you've done a really good job with building this entire recovery routine. And we had part 1 and part 2 where we did the cold plunge, did the morning routine stuff, but I mean, just what are you doing for your diet right now in a nutshell? How would you describe it?
I mean, I could probably narrow it down to what I eat. Probably less than 10 things. I would say it's kind of very ancestral. I like a lot of grass-fed, grass-finished beef, cooked in a good fat, whether tallow, ghee, butter, suet. And then I try to implement some organs, raw dairy, a really good source of corn and soy-free eggs, whether it's chicken or duck, raw cheese, a nice sea salt, as we were just piling it on our steaks this morning. What else? And then I like doing carb refeeds after like strenuous workouts. So I do like berries, dates, maple syrup, raw honey, anything like a hunter-gatherer ancestor would be finding in the wild.
Nice.
And
yeah, and
so far so good. So I don't know, we'll find out though.
Well, I mean, that's kind of like, what is it? You know, Liver King, Brian's really big on that kind of thing. And the thing I like about, like, when you look at pure carnivore, when you look at things like that, there's a little bit of this hesitation surrounding some fruits, some vegetables, things like that. And I think that you kind of have this approach of realistic, right? Like if you were in a hunter-gatherer kind of situation, you'd come across, you know, a kill where you'd have a bunch of meat, but you also might come across a blackberry bush where you're going to load up on 200 grams of carbohydrates. And we live in this world where we're kind of artificially creating these hunts, and we're artificially creating exercise that would normally be applied in regular life 1,000 years ago. So that kind of changes the dynamic a little bit, because we're artificially creating a stimulus that we have to replenish. And one of the things that I appreciate about you is that you're not afraid to carb backload, have carbohydrates after, you know, strenuous workout. And as a professional athlete, I think that's still important. And in the keto world and in the carnivore world, sometimes I think some of that is lacking for the proper, I don't want to say recovery response, but the mTOR stimulation to really like take the benefits that you're getting from a keto diet or from anything like that and actually put them into effect, right? Being able to utilize the carbohydrates for that brief insulin spike, put you into a growth mode, and then immediately go right back into, you know, the mode that you are for recovery, for anti-inflammatory effects and things like that.
And I think like carb refeeding at night too really helps with my sleep.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't really say it's more of a diet. It's just kind of like a lifestyle. Like we did the cold plunge this morning. We got a training session, and at night I try to limit. I mean, everyone's guilty of binge watching TV. I mean, have you seen Yellowstone yet? It's freaking awesome. So that's but I'll try to cut it off a certain time before bed, and just try to get back to how our ancestors kind of roamed in the wild, like mitigating blue light before I go to bed, like getting cold exposure for like that certain bouts of stress, getting in the sauna for the heat, just having camaraderie amongst my peers and my family members, like sharing a meal, like community, like all that. I think it encompasses one thing, and so that's basically how I try to live.
One of the things you mentioned earlier I thought was interesting was, I mean, you don't really have any set period of time between meals per se. You don't really say, hey, I'm gonna have 2 meals today, or I'm gonna have 3 meals today. It's not like this crazy structured thing. It's structured in the essence of the kinds of foods that you eat and your, I don't want to say restriction, but your inventory of the foods that you would eat. But you're pretty lax in terms of like, hey, I'm going to eat 1 large meal, and then, hey, you know, if I'm hungry later, I'll eat another large meal. So sometimes it's 1, sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's 3. I mean, any real structure there?
It's all pretty much intuitive. Like, you know, like you followed me around today. Like, we went to this one place to do my throwing program, and then went to another place to do my training program, and then I'll do like recovery modalities afterwards. So I'm like kind of all over the place. It's kind of hard to like mix in all these meals. So I'm not gonna stress myself out about missing one meal. It's gonna be okay. Like I'm gonna have food tomorrow or in a couple hours. Like I'm not gonna. I used to beat myself up about like when I would train, like, oh, I got to go eat like 45 minutes to an hour afterwards. I'm like, yeah, it'd be nice in a perfect world, but since I'm all over the place and I just don't want to go stop at some restaurant because regardless if it's super healthy or not, I just get paranoid about the oils they cook in, because I think the restaurants kind of like their margin for profit is so slim. Like they're going to cut corners anywhere they can. They might have grass-fed beef, but what do they cook that grass-fed? What do they cook that grass-fed beef in?
No, 100%. And I feel like, you know, one of the things we touched on earlier is like when you look at post-workout nutrition, there's this thought process that we only have this 45-minute or 30-minute anabolic window to actually, you know, get growth out of that. I mean, that's been long since really debunked. I mean, it's really more like 24 to 48 hours that protein synthesis stays elevated, and especially on a ketogenic diet, or just even, I would still consider what you're doing ketogenic, because the amount of carbs that I've seen you eat, at least, considering how active you are, I mean, you're nowhere close to, you know, getting knocked out of that. You know, you absolutely, if you're having 50, 60, 70, even 100 grams of carbs for a guy your size and how much you're moving around, just how fat adapted you are, you're going to be back in ketosis really quick. You know, by looking at that, it's really like you are so protein sparing and muscle sparing in a ketogenic state because you're sparing leucine. That's kind of the interesting thing with keto in the first place, or just any kind of low carb protocol, is when ketone bodies are present, they're leucine sparing, which means that you're not in this aggressive muscle building mode, but you are more muscle sparing than you would be otherwise. And that gives you a lot more grace in terms of how much time you have after your workout. So if you have a 2-hour workout and you got yourself deep into a ketogenic state during that period of time, as long as you're not like finishing that workout and just like, I don't know, having a bunch of carbohydrates right after that workout and then having your protein 6 hours later, like if you were to just not eat at all after that workout and wait for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 hours, most of the time that protein that you consume 6, 7, 8 hours later, it's still going to be allocated towards that muscle protein breakdown that occurred as a result of that workout. Mm-hmm. And you brought up such a good point. It's like, at what point do you say, like, the stress of trying to find the right food within 45 minutes, that stress is going to trigger, that's going to outweigh any benefit of the food that you really get in that 45-minute period. You're better off to just wait until you get home and you can have the controlled diet. Mm-hmm. We're drinking raw goat milk. I mean, you're big on raw dairy.
Yep.
I mean, a little bit of, like, share some of, like, we had some interesting stuff this morning. We have the raw goat milk. You've got some.
That's raw cream.
Yeah.
Some raw water buffalo butter that we all put in our coffees. And was that it? Yeah, I think that was about it. And some goat milk as well. I've recently discovered raw dairy within the last 3 or 4 months that I'm just like obsessed with it. I don't know if it's like my body telling me that that's what it was craving for the longest time. Because I read Kate Shanahan's book, Deep Nutrition, and how she talks about how raw dairy and conventional raised, pasteurized, homogenized dairy is like, they're two completely different things.
Yeah, it's a whole different world. And I guess notice you've got a lot of what's called, A2 protein stuff in there, A2 milk, A2 dairy in general, which is just, we touched on this a little bit in the car, but just kind of for reference with people that are watching, it's like A2 is a type of casein protein. And what happened is there was X number of years ago, a long time ago, there was basically the other type, right? There was A1, or it originally was A2. And then what happened through modification and gene altering and just kind of progression is it's become A1 over time. And A2, we as humans have the ability to process a lot better. A1, kind of the theory behind that is it's higher in what's called BCM7, which is a bioactive opioid. So literally an opioid, just like the name implies, right? So there is an addictive component to it, but there's also a psychological component that may not be the best thing for us. And it's not necessarily like it's poisoning our brain kind of woo-woo stuff. It's more so like, is this really good for our nervous system? Is really good, like is it good for our brain? There's arguments on there that different proteins are easier to break down or not easier to break down in A2. I think it's more about the bioactive opioids that make it, better or worse. Mm-hmm. So I'm a big fan of the A2. We talked about goat, when it comes down to dairy, like goat butter, goat milk, goat cream, goat cheese, all that is like top notch, especially because the MCT content is so high too. So for keto, like we were talking about this morning, for energy boost and trying to, like, in a ketogenic state, the best kind of dairy that you could probably have for performance, easier to digest, easier to break down, easier to assimilate those fats into an actual energy fuel. What are some of the brands that you use? I want to give credit where credit's due, because you had some really interesting stuff.
I had part of my diet, I like to do just a deconstructed burger bowl with quality grass-fed ground beef, raw cheese, avocado, eggs, and they had a fermented ketchup that's actually really good. But White Oak Pastures has this Oregon blend that's ground beef. It's 40% chuck and brisket, 20% liver, 20% heart, 10% spleen, and 10% kidney. And I mean, you cook it up and it looks just like normal ground beef. If I would have made a burger, nobody would know the difference, that there was actually ground up organs in there. Amos Miller, or Miller's Organic Farm, the Amish folks in Pennsylvania, they have, if the world continues to go to, I'm just going to go live with the Amish, because they have the best quality food, and like they don't have any access to technology, which is, I think, what we all need nowadays. Dutch Meadows for the corn and soy-free chicken and duck eggs, and plus their packaging, when they send it, it's like there's no, like, you think like, how do they send eggs across the country? But every egg that I've ever gotten from them is completely intact. Even the yolks inside are still intact. Force of Nature, White Oak Pastures, US Wellness, those are all unbelievable brands that I use quite often.
Yeah, no, it's the duck eggs that we had, and just so you know, I did a separate video on duck eggs before. As far as like general macronutrient ratios go, slightly higher fat to protein ratio in a duck egg, but probably the best thing is significantly higher vitamin D content, which I think is, when you look at Noah's lifestyle and my lifestyle, and a lot of these guys and gals that are kind of in our, let's call it metabolic health kind of circle, it all kind of circumnavigates to this big main thing. It's like vitamin A, vitamin D, like it's always kind of coming back to that. Vitamin A, liver, things like that, spleen, things like that, they're going to drive those values up. Vitamin D, natural sunlight, vitamin D from food. Even vitamin D, even if you have to get it from plant sources, mushrooms, vitamin D2, it still has a conversion process that it has to go through, so it's not as concentrated. But anything rich in vitamin D that's going to be soaking up sunlight, and pasture-raised eggs, I think there was a study, I can't remember what it was published in, but pasture-raised hens, even in this case, that were outside, had 3 to 4x the vitamin D content in the actual yolk of the egg compared to hens that were inside. So, where you get your eggs, people will say like, oh, cage-free this, cage-free that, whatever. If they're not legitimately outside, you're really doing yourself a disservice. And I think we're in a generation now where we're not just looking at basic macronutrients, protein, fats, and carbs. I mean, we have to look at, especially when you get down to the micronutrients, the fat-soluble micronutrients, like the vitamin A, the vitamin D, especially you coming back from injuries, that is imperative, absolutely imperative.
When you look at chicken and pork, and like they are what they eat, so if they're ingesting a bunch of crap, GMO feed, then you're going to get that as well when you ingest that. So yeah.
There's a lot of back and forth, on the internet about that. Like, is GMO or grain-fed beef really that much better than grass-fed beef? And again, it gets into this like nebulous conversation that is he said, she said. And I think the bottom line is like, you don't really want to be worrying so much about like the omega-3 content, right? So like, I just kind of want to address that. Like with your beef and your meat, omega-3 content is important, but it's such a small amount in beef that's really not the big concern. It's more about it's hormones, it's all of that that's coming through it. And then if they're eating a bunch of soy and eating a bunch of corn, how is that affecting the micronutrient profile of beef itself? I'm not carnivore, but I do know that the carnivore community is very big on the amount of micronutrients that are actually in good quality beef. And that is something that people need to be paying attention to. Like if you're largely leaning on higher amounts of protein and higher amounts of meat as your fuel source in the first place, then micronutrient needs become very important. And if you start, so no one's really looking at the micronutrient profile of low quality meat versus high quality meat because no one's took an interest before. Because we've always looked at food as protein, fats, and carbs, and micronutrients only come from vegetables, and we don't look at what's in our actual meat content. So with the grass-fed, grass-finished, you're generally looking at a higher vitamin content in the first place. So if it's a staple to your diet, then I don't want to say you're able to get away without eating vegetables. That would be probably a stretch, but you're allowing yourself, a wider plethora of nutrients.
And grass-fed, grass-finished beef, like they're the benefits they have on the environment too, like with regenerative farming.
Yeah.
It's proven that they take carbon out of the environment if they're raised the right way, whereas conventionally raised cows, I'm not so sure.
Yeah. No, it's definitely, and it's one of those things where, okay, if everyone ate that way, what would happen? Would at that point, could the world sustain everybody eating that way? I don't know. But I think there's probably a line of diminishing return to a certain point. But I think the level of people that actually want to optimize their health and optimize their life in general, unfortunately, is a fairly small subset of the world. So, but if we can at least kind of condition people that are focused on optimization and focused on performance and focused on longevity and focused on that to start like looking at that picture of regenerative farming and what that looks like. And I mean, regenerative farming doesn't just go with, it goes for dairy and everything too, so it's even the communities that are maybe vegetarian or lacto-ovo, where they're still eating eggs and dairy. I mean, this is absolutely something that should be pushed. I mean, I think if even the vegetarian community can make a heavy push towards regenerative farming for eggs and for dairy, could get a lot more buy-in. It's just tough because there's a lot of opposition right now.
For sure.
Yeah. One of the things I'm curious about, like, how do you eat when you're on the road?
It's not easy. There was a meal delivery service, they're no longer in business, that I would use called Ketone Bodies. The guy that ran that would send me meals all the time. And then I was working with one nutritionist. I haven't really heard from her in a while, but she would contact chefs in the towns or the cities I would go to. Like one time we went to Pittsburgh and she contacted the chef at Capitol Grill, and he went out to Whole Foods and got everything that I wanted on the menu with all my dietary restrictions and cooked the way I wanted it. So that's typically how I go about things. But when I was with the Mets, they did a pretty good job at making sure in between batting practice or after the game that there was pretty healthy meals. But I'm super picky when it comes to certain stuff.
Well, I think it's I think there needs to be, and this isn't to say anything negative about anything, but I think if there's more athletes like you that are putting focus on nutrition and getting it out there, because you're one of the first mainstream professional athletes that is pretty open about nutrition. You talk about it a lot. You don't take hard stances in things. I like that you're very open, but you're very honest about nutrition being important. And I mean, more than anyone that, your job above all else is being idols for kids too, right? And that's so important. And for me with a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, I want them to look at athletes like you, like that are, even if I don't potentially align with the choices that they're making. I even respect vegan athletes. I'm not vegan, but I respect the fact that sometimes they can be dogmatic, but if they're open about like making a positive choice for their body and performance optimization from a nutrition standpoint, I got to give that a stamp of credit, right? Like at least they're helping kids understand that nutrition plays a role. But I think that there's a much bigger piece that needs to be looked at, like you're doing, like this whole kind of, for lack of a better term, holistic thing, right? The cold plunge, the sauna. And it's like if kids these days can grow up looking at stuff like that and understand that, wow, professional athletes actually care about like what they put in their body. It's not just about how hard you're grinding, and it's more about how you can recover.
Yeah, you can work hard all you want,
Yeah.
but you got to be able to get with the right gas.
Yeah, for sure. So it's inspiring to see that, and I'll tell you for sure, my kids are gonna grow up watching guys like you, because it's like I want that to be able to set that example. And you look at ex-athletes, and a lot of them start falling apart when they're 50, right? They start, in any sport, they just don't take care of themselves, and once the focus is off of them, it's like they haven't established the rituals and the habits for themselves, right? It's like everything is done for them.
Well, I'd be doing this even if I didn't play baseball. Like this is what I'm passionate about. This is who I am. So
Yeah.
it just so happens I get to play a sport for a living.
Yeah, no, for sure. And the last thing before I let everyone go is, we talked about one thing that Noah and I both do is you said you're really big on like at least a 12-hour fasting period, like every day. That's kind of like a norm for you, right?
Right, and I try to shut down my eating like 2 or 3 hours before bed. But I mean, I like to do like maybe 4 to 5 hours, but that's just, I mean, what you were talking about earlier is like when I have like maybe a super busy day and I get home at like 6, maybe I have like some lean protein, maybe a glass of goat milk, and wait till breakfast, have a big meal then. But yeah, I think 12-hour eating windows is crucial. I feel like people nowadays, it's like they're just constantly stimulating like their pancreas to produce more insulin and more insulin. I think that's why people are becoming insulin resistant, and just I mean look what our ancestors were doing. Like they weren't eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner on the plains of wherever they were hunting, so
And that's just what's crazy is like we can actually handle a fair bit of carbohydrate load if we are insulin sensitive and can deal with it. And that's the thing, is it's the consistent insulin response that is the issue. It's like if you take someone that is, let's say you and I that are ketogenic, and I can speak for myself, let me make this anecdotal so I'm not like speaking out of turn, but I can go 2 weeks without touching a carbohydrate, be wearing a continuous glucose monitor, and then I could go eat 100 grams of good carbohydrates, not refined garbage. And if I'm looking at my CGM, I'll have a big spike and a big drop back to baseline. My drop doesn't go below baseline, meaning I'm not having a blood sugar crash, which is a great indicator that my insulin response did exactly what it was supposed to do. It responded to the glucose, brought everything back down to baseline, and it did what insulin is supposed to do. It is supposed to be glucose is a proxy for what's going to happen with insulin. You have a spike in glucose, you're going to have a spike in insulin, and you should come back to baseline. So, for me, yeah, if I'm keto or if I'm low carb, my body will respond to those carbohydrates. But when you're consistently asking the beta cells within your pancreas to respond, it's like having a fan on all the time, where eventually you hear the fan, but you don't register the fan is going. And then if the fan were to turn off, that white noise were to turn off, it's like crystal clear, right? Mm-hmm. So it's almost like you have this static of insulin in your body all the time, where your cells have just been like, oh, there's insulin again, he's just doing his thing, it's just the fan that's running. And then all of a sudden you give yourself a break, whether it's through fasting, whether it's through keto, whether it's through just even intense exercise, it's like an accelerated form of that, then all of a sudden everything kind of comes back to baseline a little bit and you become insulin sensitive again. And people tend to think that like insulin resistance is this thing you can never come back from, and it's absolutely not the case. It's just, it's very difficult for society to take a break from food. So I think that regardless of what people are doing, like being able to have those like 12-hour breaks, like just like 12-hour fast minimum, just don't eat between the hours of 7 and 7. You could do nothing else with your diet. I don't mean go eat whatever you want, but you could really do nothing else. Like if everyone today just decided I'm going to stop eating at 7, I'm not going to eat again until 7, I can almost guarantee that everyone would see some kind of positive outcome, whether it be body composition, their sleep, their appetite, their energy, their cognition, something within those categories. And that alone counts for a win. So I think if there's one takeaway that you may not want to eat duck eggs, you may not want to eat raw milk, you may not want to do that, but one of the things, like, I think a big takeaway is that, you know, that's, I think if athletes could pick that up, they'd notice a huge increase in performance. And do you ever do any longer fasts?
Not yet, no. I used to do like maybe like 16 and 8,
Yeah.
and every now and then I'll do like a 24-hour fast, but nothing longer than that. And I've had nights where I've just like consumed myself with a bunch of berries and milk and honey and maple syrup, and I'll still wake up the next morning and test my ketones, although I haven't done it in a while. But I'll still be in a ketogenic state, and my glucose won't be like super high either. So
Yeah, that's the thing, right? It's like, I think there's this fallacy that we have to be, if we're keto or we're doing keto or we're doing low carb, that we have to like subscribe to this one way of thinking that we can't have carbohydrates. And like, there's so many different ways to go about it, right? Like a guy your size, a guy with the amount of muscle that I carry too, it's like those carbohydrates are going to get sucked into something. Carbohydrates have two fates, and that's plain and simple, or three really. Okay, fate number one is they get burned immediately for fuel. Fate number two is they go into muscle glycogen and store. And fate number three is they don't do that and they go through de novo lipogenesis and store as fat. It's really that simple. And if you have a bigger glucose sink by having more muscle, or you're more active and your glucose receptors and GLUT4 translocation is good, then that glucose is going to have a place to go. And ketone formation doesn't stop because you ate a carb. Ketone formation stops because you have a presence of insulin. So if your insulin spikes are short and sweet, you're going to be right back in ketogenesis. It's all about being able to understand how to manipulate that, all while giving yourself, you know, the fundamental micronutrients that you need to have like a long, healthy life. So anyway, with that, man, you're an inspiration. I appreciate the hell out of you.
Thank you as well. I appreciate your guidance and your knowledge and wisdom and teaching me along the way.
Right on, man. Thanks, brother.
Thank you.
I like Trader Joe's a lot. They've got those goat cheese slices.
The goat's milk cheese. This is one of the best finds that Trader Joe's has.
Something, I don't know what it is with them, but I mean, they're still the same A2 protein. The goat is all A2. So that's kind of the nice thing, is you're granted a little bit of amnesty with a goat, because it's just naturally an A2 protein. So and goats are typically pumped full of a ton of hormones, so you're usually pretty safe with goat either way.
There's a brand in California called just Raw Farm. Have you heard of this?
Yeah.
And I was talking to them on social media, and they said like, if it's raw, like they haven't found any data like differentiating like A1 or A2 dairy. But if it's like not raw, then yeah, for sure.
Well, it's not so much about the quality of the dairy at that point. It's more about the BCM7, the bioactive opioids that are in A1. So it triggers an opioid response in your brain. So the addictive quality of it is significantly worse. And then when you start getting down to the level of detail, actually this is something I literally wrote down to talk to Andrew Huberman about, because the dopamine hit that you get from it, you know, in my opinion, you could potentially burn out dopamine receptors like a lot faster, because dairy has a very strong addictive property. But so I always opt for A2 whenever I can, and I really base it on feel. I mean, it's like, again, this is all my own anecdotal experience, right? So like, can we take it to the academia bank? No, but I usually can tell pretty darn well within 12 hours if I eat something, especially dairy, that's gonna inflame me. Joints hurt, back hurts. Feel it pretty quick. I never feel that way with good culture, so they're doing something right. Someone needs to make a good goat cottage cheese.
Have you had access deer before?
No.
Apparently they run rampant in Hawaii. There's a brand called Maui Venison. I haven't ordered from them yet because they're always like out of stock. Like they sell out quick. But I know Force of Nature used to have venison tomahawk fillets. Those things were freaking outstanding.
Fan of wild boar at all?
Yeah, I like wild boar.
Such a good monounsaturated fat content. So if you take wild boar, or I mean pork in general, but wild boar especially, it's not heavily marbled, it's pretty lean, right? So you can trim off the big layer of palmitic and saturated fat that you may not want. Because different saturated fats are different. Like you have palmitic, you have myristic, and you have stearic. Myristic is kind of like a neutral saturated fat that isn't really good or bad. Stearic acid is phenomenally good for you. Like a lot of times with ribeyes, it's like you'll get some of that stearic, so it's good.
I used to cook in a lot of suet.
Yeah.
stearic acid.
Exactly. If you can cook in pure stearic acid, that's the bomb. So good.